Tonight, the scandal that reached into the heart of the British establishment.
It's about power. Power and the abuse of power.
It's centred on Rupert Murdoch's media empire. Now, one of his editors, Andy Coulson, faces jail for phone hacking. He denied it for years and ended up in David Cameron's Downing Street.
He showed wretched judgment, and it will permanently damage his reputation as British Prime Minister.
David Cameron's friend Rebecca Brooks has been cleared of any involvement in phone hacking and bribing public officials. Rupert Murdoch has always stood by his well-connected protégé.
She was a political animal, without a shadow of a doubt. She was able to collect the right sort of people.
3 senior News of the World journalists had already pleaded guilty to criminally targeting people's private lives. Phone hacking was unleashed on the rich and the famous, but no one was off limits.
Hacking doesn't just happen to celebrities, it happens a lot to real people. Your whole world is completely turned upside down.
Even people under police protection weren't safe.
For that information to get into the hands of journalists is potentially putting people's lives at risk.
For years, the police sat on the evidence that eventually brought down the News of the World.
To put you into the dark and say you're just a moaning Minnie kind of thing, when they actually knew, and while they were publicly denying it, then you really do get sickened up about that.
Phone hacking was the scandal covered up by News International for years. Now Panorama reveals how police and politicians let them get away with it.
We were all being told that what we had was a democracy, but in fact, we didn't have anything of the sort.
Imagine someone listening into your telephone messages.
Yeah, hello, it's Glenn.
Glenn, how are you?
Hello, mate. Just a very quick one.
Imagine someone does it day after day after day.
Put his number in.
Yeah.
It asks you to put a pin, then put his number back in.
Yeah.
And there's 3 messages on there.
Imagine it happening to you.
On that shred of paper was David Beckham's name, and underneath that was my name, which was quite shocking, really.
Claire has been violated. She would be just so shocked if she was to know what went on after her death.
This is the man who secretly listened in on not just those lives, but thousands of others. Master hacker Glenn Mulcair.
Mulcair himself is a frantic kind of character. See, he's working very, very hard. I mean, there was an example came out in the evidence where he was hacking Kerry Katona's voicemail on Christmas Day.
Rupert Murdoch's company, News International, paid him £1 million to hack for journalists.
During the 5 years he was working for them, they were tasking him at least once every day, 7 days a week, for 5 years.
But one story changed everything. It laid bare just how powerful and arrogant Rupert Murdoch's company had become. In March 2002, a 13-year-old schoolgirl, Millie Dowler, was snatched as she walked home from a Surrey school.
We're devastated, we're just so desperately worried, and we just want to have Millie back home with us so much.
While Millie's parents made public pleas for their daughter's safe return, Glenn Mulcair secretly hacked into her phone messages. He found one from a recruitment agency in Shropshire, apparently offering Millie a job interview.
We're ringing because we've got some interviews starting. Can you call me back? Thanks. Bye.
The hacked message convinced the News of the World that Millie was alive.
You might imagine that a normal human being with any sense of feeling would say to the Dowler family or to the police, we found Millie Dowler. But they chose not to do that because their story on a Sunday was more important to them than putting the family's mind at ease.
The hack was just the start. The News of the World now thought it had that week's exclusive, and it sent 6 reporters and photographers to Telford.
When you realise you've been targeted by a tabloid newspaper, it's intimidating. It's quite frightening.
In Telford, Mark Hancox and his mother Valerie ran the recruitment agency which had left the message on Millie's phone. It would later become clear the message was never meant for Millie. They'd simply dialed the wrong number.
Even though I knew she couldn't be working for us as she was only 13, I felt sick that the News of the World was on the doorstep.
Within minutes of turning a reporter away from his home, Mark was surprised to receive a call from one of the paper's most senior figures.
I was totally shocked to get a phone call from Stuart Kuttner, the managing editor of News of the World. He truly believed that Millie Dowler was working for our recruitment agency.
The agency's checks revealed, as expected, there was no Millie Dowler on their books. But it didn't stop attempts to damage to Hancox's business. A reporter approached the manager of their biggest client on a golf course and told him they were employing underage girls.
He wasn't amused, as you can imagine, so he summons me, and I can remember driving down there thinking, all this hard work that I've done, we're going to lose it all.
Desperate to get their story, the News of the World then played Millie's hack message to Surrey police, who were investigating her disappearance, and printed its content in early editions of the paper.
It shows you so much about the News of the World, not just the ruthless decision in the beginning to keep that secret from the police, but then the arrogant aggression that we can tell the police we're breaking the law and they won't bother to enforce it. And the worst thing of all, they were right.
Surrey police accept the hacking of Millie's phone should have been investigated in 2002. It's yet to explain why it wasn't. In charge of the News of the World that week was Deputy Editor Andy Coulson. His boss, Rebecca Brooks, was on holiday and says she never knew the paper had listened to Millie's messages. But it would take 9 years for what the News of the World did that week to be exposed.
The News of the World is at the centre of new allegations of illegal phone hacking.
Heaping shame and humiliation on Rupert Murdoch.
Did you apologise to the Dowler family?
What happened showed the newspaper's contempt for the law, for the police, and for a family which appeared to be getting in its way. This was the ugly face of Rupert Murdoch's empire. After 168 years, one of Britain's most famous newspapers was shut down in disgrace.
This is not where we wanted to be, and it's not where we deserve to be.
By the end, many felt the paper got its just desserts.
I think the News of the World journalists grew incredibly arrogant in the last decade of the paper's life.
Could we just have you stood together and then we'll go? Yeah.
Behind the rise of the News of the World was the paper's owner, media tycoon Rupert Murdoch, and his protégé, Rebecca Brooks. Murdoch was the brash Australian who took Fleet Street by storm.
What's your philosophy as a proprietor of a newspaper? To produce as good newspapers as possible and to sell as many of them as possible.
Within 15 years, he bought up some of its most famous titles, including The Sun and The News of the World. His progress made easier when Margaret Thatcher bypassed rules on media ownership. By the late 80s, Rebekah Brooks had got her first job in newspapers. Tabloid reporter Charles Ray remembers her well.
Obviously, the first thing you spotted straight off was the hair. I mean, it was the best hair I've seen on anybody, you know. It's just fantastic hair.
She joined the News of the World as a researcher aged 21. Her rise was meteoric. Deputy editor of the News of the World at 27. Deputy editor of The Sun at 29. And that was just the beginning.
She had this remarkable capacity to engage with anyone. And the more powerful you were, the more clever she was at finding some link to you.
She was a political animal. She was able to collect the right sort of people.
Rebekah Brooks and Rupert Murdoch were made for each other. She was a problem solver. So this is what we ought to do. Now that's fantastically good for any boss.
Together, they would wield enormous political influence. Politicians craved their backing. After 4 election defeats, Labour wanted some Murdoch magic.
How you going?
You come halfway around the world to talk to Rupert Murdoch and his men.
Well, it's important, obviously, because this is a major conference of one of the largest media outlets in the world.
The leader of the opposition was determined to have his moment in the sun.
There was a lot of hostility in the past. I think it's important the Labour Party makes the case as to why, in a world of very great change, we are the best people to handle that change.
But some Labour colleagues doubted the wisdom of courting Rupert Murdoch.
I don't trust Murdoch, the Sun, and all his outfit, and I was always against a cosy. You could have a professional relationship, but it always suggested it was more than that, wasn't it? With the implication that we can help you win the election.
It was help Tony Blair calculated he couldn't do without. His strategy landed him a political coup.
This was the beginning of an incredibly incestuous, close relationship between senior politicians and senior journalists, particularly on News International.
Some senior journalists there broke the law to get stories, but their editor, Rebekah Brooks, needed only to rely on her charm. While New Labour settled into power, she settled in for cosy dinners with the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor.
It became clear that Rebekah Brooks would have a dinner with Gordon Brown, tell him certain information of what she thinks Blair's told her. He would have a go at me, and then the other way, Blair would have a dinner, and he'd have a go at me for what Gordon's supposed to be doing. She was playing these two men off.
It was detestable in many ways if you believe that journalism is about telling the truth and being beastly to people in power. For her, it became a form of social assent.
It's not just whether they write the story, they're actively involved, playing the part in the politics, and she was right at the centre of it.
News International seduced politicians with the tantalising promise of support. But its journalists had the power to make or break careers. At the News of the World, private detectives were being used to dig up the most confidential and sensitive of personal information.
The journalist would act, say, upon a tip, give it to the news desk, who had certain contacts. That may be access to bank account details, so phone accounts. They'll come back and say, yeah, you're right, write it.
One man who would thrive in that culture was Andy Coulson. He was Rebekah Brooks's deputy at the News of the World and her secret lover. The 32-year-old was another rising News International star. His background was in showbiz reporting, an agenda his editor was keen to pursue.
And now, the latest news. Andy Coulson is in the hot seat today.
Andy Coulson had for years been the Sun's showbiz reporter and editor, which he wasn't shy of boasting about on children's TV.
I was editing Bizarre. I got to interview pretty much all of my favourite stars, really, all the big names. Madonna, Spice Girls, Sly Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Elton John.
Sean Hall worked with Andy Coulson at The Sun in the 90s and for him at the News of the World in 2001. He claimed his boss was familiar with the use of private detectives.
I'm sure Andy, well, I know he was aware of those practices because at the end of the day, such is the culture.
We tried to ask Andy Heyman about this, but he didn't want to respond. In court, Rebekah Brooks said the News of the World hired lots of private detectives to track down paedophiles as part of her campaign to name and shame convicted sex offenders after the murder of Sarah Payne.
The paper is on the side of protecting children and not the rights of paedophiles, and I strongly believe we're on the side of the right. The public are behind us.
But what kind of private detectives was the News of the World hiring?
Yeah, hello, it's Glenn. Glenn, how are you? Hello, mate. Just a very quick one.
One was master hacker Glenn Mulcair, a former footballer who scored AFC Wimbledon's first ever goal. He started working for the News of the World in the late 90s. Journalist Nick Davis believes he was hacking into phones even then.
By around 97, 98, he's come up with the voicemail trick. I don't know where he got that from, but he starts doing that for News of the World as early as 97, 98.
You need to dial 7973 100 123. Put his
By 2001, Glenn Mulcair had a 5-year contract, and he ended up being paid more than £100,000 a year. Rebekah Brooks said in court she didn't know he was working for the paper. In 2003, Rebekah Brooks landed the biggest job in tabloid newspapers, editor of The Sun. Just 2 months later, she let slip that News International would go as far as paying police officers.
Just the one element of whether you ever pay the police for information.
Yeah. We have paid the police for information in the past, and it's been...
And will you do it in the future?
It depends on...
We operate within the code and within the law, and if there's a clear public interest, then the same holds for private detectives, for subterfuge, for video bags, whatever you want to talk about.
I thought Rebekah Brooks and Andy Coulson had basically made an amazing, extraordinary confession. It's illegal for police officers to receive payments.
No, we don't. As I said, within the law.
OK, thanks, Chris. You've got your answer.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.
Everybody thought, my God, Brian, what have you done? I mean, you've stirred up a hornet's nest.
But the MP's efforts to stir it up even more fell on deaf ears.
I tried raising it with newspapers, nobody would run it. I tried raising it with other members of the committee, they weren't interested. I tried raising it with successive Home Secretaries, they just batted it off and said it was up to the police to investigate.
Isn't it one about CID, fellas?
I raised it with the police, they wouldn't touch it.
Now look, Monty Green, you try this on again and you'll get into trouble.
Tony Blair swept to power for a third time in 2005 with, once again, the backing of the Murdoch machine. But the following year there were rumblings of discontent within the Labour Party. A group of MPs wanted Tony Blair to make it clear when he would stand aside for Gordon Brown. they were branded a gang of weasels by Rebekah Brooks's son.
But there was a more sinister and intimidating element that I'd not really prepared myself for, which was the sort of sense that the News International newspapers were in one political camp, and that was Tony Blair's.
At the News of the World, Andy Coulson was now editor. Reporters were under increasing pressure to deliver exclusives.
People were scared, right? So if you've got to get a story, you've got to get it. And you have to get that by whatever means.
Andy Coulson's editorship has been described as the era of industrial phone hacking. At the heart of it, Glenn Mulcaire. No one, it seems, was off limits. 7 casualties. Murder victims.
Hacking doesn't just happen to celebrities. It happens a lot to real people. Your whole world is completely turned upside down.
Patricia Bernal's daughter Claire worked as a beauty consultant at Harvey Nichols in London. In September 2005, she was shot dead in a store by a stalker. That same day of Claire's murder, the News of the World stuffed a packet of cash through the family letterbox, seeking an exclusive interview. 24 hours later, Glenn Mulcaire hacked into Claire's phone.
Glenn Mulcaire had been told to gather information a day after her death, and they had access to my dead daughter, and to me that was just the most distressing thing. They would have heard personal messages. Claire was a very private person, and I'll always feel angry about that.
Claire's mother knew nothing about her daughter's phone being hacked until police told her 6 years later.
If they think about their own families, their own children, to cross that line and to do what they did, it's obscene.
So did Andy Coulson know hacking was endemic? He claimed he didn't at his trial, but he finally did admit, for the first time, he knew it had happened.
In 2004, his chief reporter, Neville Thurlbeck, played him intimate recordings left by David Blunkett, who was then Home Secretary, to Mr. Blunkett's then lover.
Andy Coulson told the court he didn't know accessing the messages was illegal, but he was shocked and angry that Neville Thurlbeck had hacked them and told him to stop immediately. But that didn't stop Andy Coulson travelling up to Sheffield to confront David Blunkett about the affair.
It became very clear to me that something very strange had been going on.
It never crossed David Blunkett's mind he was a victim of hacking, believing instead he'd been betrayed by someone close to him. And Andy Coulson gave nothing away.
He was not prepared not only to give any kind of indication of where he'd obtained the information from, but any legitimacy in terms of the process he'd adopted.
Despite promising he wouldn't damage him, 2 days later the story was splashed all over the News of the World's front page. The cabinet minister became tabloid fodder and resigned 4 months later. The police later found in a News of the World safe recordings of 330 voicemail messages David Blunkett had left for his lover.
I came as close as anyone could ever come to having a breakdown without actually having one. In fact, I actually think it probably took me 2 years to really recover.
The News of the World hadn't named his lover, but the next day, Rebekah Brooks's son did. Even that didn't stop David Blunkett socialising with its editor.
I don't regret that, because that had nothing to do with my willingness to have a sensible, friendly relationship with them.
David Blunkett was later hired by The Sun as a columnist, and he became a paid advisor to News International on social responsibility. By 2005, the News of the World's front page exclusives had won Andy Coulson Newspaper of the Year. But then a small story by the Royal editor Clive Goodman sowed the seeds of its downfall. Royal aides had long suspected their phones were being hacked. The story of Prince William's knee injury confirmed it. The information could only have come from their phones.
You're tripping the alarm bell in the one group of people in this country who had so much prestige that the police weren't going to ignore them. It's the royal family. They're going to go after it.
Now, within the past hour, 2 men, including the royal editor of the News of the World, have been charged with intercepting telephone voicemail messages.
Clive Goodman and hacker Glenn Mulcair both pleaded guilty. Both were jailed. Editor Andy Coulson said he took responsibility and he resigned. News International insisted its royal editor was a lone wolf, a rogue reporter.
It was 2007, 4 years before the furore over phone hacking properly erupted. But the judge seemed convinced even then that Glenn Mulcair had been working with others at News International because he admitted to having hacked the phones of 5 other people, none of whom had any connection with the royal family.
The Met knew too, and much more besides. They'd already found the names of 400 hacking targets in Glenn Mulcair's notebooks.
He's making notes about what numbers he's got and who he's talking to in the mobile phone company. And just so that he doesn't lose track, he got into the habit of writing the first name of whoever it was had tasked him in the top left-hand corner. They had this line of clues. It's Clive, it's Neville, it's James, it's Greg. Mulcair's notes are really the hand grenade in the middle of the room.
The names on the list included victims of crime, celebrities, politicians, even the then Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott. But the Met told lawyers reporting to the then Director of Public Prosecutions that there was no evidence that the phone hacking conspiracy went further.
If we'd known the truth, that in fact the police were in possession of evidence that this went much wider, then we'd have acted upon that. If there were officers who knew that the answers were incorrect, it was reprehensible of them to keep quiet about that.
The Met's counter-terrorism unit was heading the investigation in what was the busiest period in its history. The 11,000 pages seized from Glenn Mulcair were not top priority.
As soon as they realised that it went much wider, then it should have been passed to the Specialist Crime Directorate, because they were far more of a fit with what they were doing than with what anti-terrorism or royalty protection were doing.
But the case stayed with counter-terrorism. Its boss, Andy Heyman's job involved having good relations with the media. But now the unit was investigating crimes by the media.
I sense that there were relationships that had become quite personal because of the amount of interaction. I think some of them were very much in a social setting, and I think that does create difficulties.
Andy Heyman was not in day-to-day charge of the investigation, but he was briefed about its progress. Before the Met knew the full extent of Glenn Mulcair's activities, Andy Heyman and a senior press officer had dinner with Andy Coulson and another senior executive from the News of the World.
Not to have that dinner, I think, would have been potentially more suspicious than to have it. And
suspicious?
I don't know why you're laughing.
Because we are astonished, Mr. Heyman, at the way in which you are answering these questions.
All I'm sure I can say to you is this, that we never, ever had a conversation that would have compromised an investigation.
This initial phone hacking investigation could potentially lead to people very high up in the organisation being accused of criminal offences for those very people to be meeting with senior officers who ultimately were responsible for that investigation is totally inappropriate.
Andy Hayman's job meant he was a frequent visitor to Downing Street. When Glenn Mulcair and Clive Goodman were arrested, the acting Prime Minister was John Prescott, yet he was never told his name was in Glenn Mulcair's notes.
He never told me. It's quite clear looking at the timetable. He knew all the time. And to be working next to the guy who's done the investigation, who's got all the information, working with me on security matters, doesn't perhaps turn to me and say, "What's your phone? What's your messages?"
Andy Hayman wouldn't respond to us. He has said he saw a list of names from Glenn Mulcair's notes, but at the time there was no clear evidence more than a handful had actually been hacked. The police didn't breathe a word to John Prescott about him being a target of phone hacking, but there was someone they told. Astonishingly, it was Rebecca Brooks. Not only did officers tell her about John Prescott, they also told her she'd been targeted and much more besides. That they'd a list of around 100 victims, but were unlikely to look at any other suspects without direct evidence.
It shouldn't have happened because I think the organisation, certainly at that time, had to be seen as a potential suspect because the Met had not unravelled the mystery of who was involved. I would expect the Met to have been very cautious.
The Met has now apologised for failing to contact all those who'd been targeted, including some of its own senior officers. But it still hasn't explained why it didn't do so.
The difficulty for the Met is, by not answering that question, it allows people to speculate. It allows people to say, well, that's obviously because they wanted to cover the whole thing up.
After his resignation from the News of the World over the royal phone hacking, Andy Coulson was hired as head of communications for the Conservative Party. He'd been recommended for the job by George Osborne, David Cameron's closest ally.
I remember a lot of people writing that what a wise decision it was by Cameron to hire this genius, hard-nosed tabloid man, Andy Coulson.
The political sands were again shifting, and David Cameron, like Tony Blair before him, was keen to have his moment in the sun. This time, Rupert Murdoch's yacht was anchored off the coast of the Greek island of Santorini. Rebecca Brooks was there too.
From my point of view, it was just an opportunity to try to get to know Rupert Murdoch better. Obviously, I was trying to win over his newspapers and put across my opinion. And so for me, it was just an opportunity to try and build that relationship.
Although Rupert Murdoch seemed indifferent to the fact that David Cameron, who diverted from a family holiday, had made the effort.
Mr. Cameron might have thought stopping Santorini would impress me.
Greece was where Rupert Murdoch's daughter Liz had celebrated her 40th. Rebecca Brooks paid tribute by getting this special edition of The Sun mocked up. Soon afterwards, Rebecca Brooks moved here, down the road from David Cameron's constituency home in Oxfordshire. She married his friend, the racehorse trainer Charlie Brooks. Liz Murdoch lived nearby too. Together they became known as the Chipping Norton set.
It was almost as if the media and politicians merged. The Murdoch empire and politicians merged. I mean, Rebecca Brooks was almost a member of the shadow cabinet.
We got to know each other because of her role in the media, my role in politics, but we struck up a friendship. And obviously our relationship got stronger when she married Charlie Brooks, who I've known for some time and who's a neighbour.
Did you often pop round to each other's houses in South Oxfordshire?
No, I think often popping around is definitely overstating the case. We occasionally met in the countryside if it was because I was there every weekend and he was there in his constituency.
And David Cameron would also meet Rupert Murdoch's son James. He told David Cameron the Sun would back him at the 2010 general election. As the election date drew nearer, David Cameron and Rebekah Brooks, now chief executive of News International, drew closer.
I think as we get closer to the election and the decision of the Sun, then the level of contact went up, and we saw each other socially more.
On a Sunday, Dave could be out trying to learn what it's like to be an ordinary Joe. You know, what it's like just to be a normal person on a Sunday. What's he doing? He's over there having a glass of champagne with Rebecca at some, party amongst the shipping Sodbury or whatever they're called set.
There'd also been numerous texts between them. Just before David Cameron gave a speech to an October 2009 party conference, Rebekah Brooks wrote,
"I am so rooting for you tomorrow, not just as a proud friend, but because professionally we're definitely in this together. Speech of your life? Yes, he can."
It showed a level of intimacy that I think was entirely inappropriate. I think that for him to allow someone like that to be so close in was a serious misjudgment.
Everybody wants to know how his texts are signed off. Can you help?
Occasionally he would sign them off LOL, lots of love. Actually, until I told him it meant laugh out loud, and then he didn't sign them like that anymore.
David Cameron has accepted that politicians and the media got too close, but he says neither he nor his policies were influenced by support from News International. The Murdoch company had kept a lid on the hacking scandal by paying off those who discovered they'd been targeted. But in 2009, The Guardian made one of the settlements public and revealed News International journalists had selected hundreds of people for phone hacking. The Met asked Assistant Commissioner John Yates to see if a fresh investigation was needed. He launched his inquiry the next morning. It was over by tea time.
No additional evidence has come to light since this case has concluded. I therefore consider that no further investigation is required.
The News International say you're wrong, it doesn't matter. The cop's sitting on all that information, a guy with a straight reputation, he comes out and says you got it wrong. That gives you a really nasty cold feeling in the pit of your stomach.
The man who'd been in overall charge of the original investigation, former Assistant Commissioner Andy Heyman, was by now a columnist for News International. He wrote in The Times that the investigation had left no stone unturned. But we've established that investigation showed Glenn Mulcair had obtained far more sensitive information than the Met had ever admitted. The details of people on the National Witness Protection Scheme.
The Witness Protection Scheme is a very expensive operation to give people who have been convicted of very serious offences and people who are very vulnerable witnesses, to give them a completely new identity so they can have a completely fresh start. For that information to get into the hands of journalists is potentially putting people's lives at risk.
Glenn Mulcair had got the new identities of 4 of the most notorious names in British criminal history, including Mary Bell and Robert Thompson, one of the killers of James Bulger. He'd been granted a High Court injunction to keep his new identity secret.
I would have expected an immediate and thorough investigation to identify how that information had got into the public domain and who was responsible for it, so that we could restore confidence in the Witness Protection Scheme.
The News of the World had already printed several articles about Robert Thompson's new life. Now the Met knew Glenn Mulcair had his and others' new identities.
I would be surprised if something of that sensitivity was not briefed up the command chain to very senior levels.
The Met says Glenn Mulcair got the information by hacking the phones of people close to those in witness protection. It says it found no evidence that he'd paid police officers for the information and has confirmed that no further action was taken. But this was so serious you'd expect that the News of the World and Glenn Mulcair would have been reported to the Attorney General. They weren't. The Attorney General has confirmed to Panorama he is now considering whether to take action. Other evidence from the original police investigation was continuing to be unearthed, including the transcript of a hacked call marked for the News of the World's chief reporter, Neville Thurlbeck. John Yates, the man who had decided not to reopen the investigation, was again on the spot.
Well, there's no evidence of an offence being committed, which is what I've said first. There's no evidence that reading that document is no evidence of an offence.
There was clearly evidence staring him in the face, had he bothered to look at it. I can only assume that he didn't want to see the evidence so that he could give the committee the denial that he did.
John Yates says his decision not to reopen the inquiry was supported by the Met's own legal advice. He's told Panorama he was never briefed about the witness protection scheme being compromised and says he may well have come to a different conclusion if he had been. Neville Thurlbeck later told Tom Watson that News International had put him and his fellow MPs on the Media Select Committee under surveillance.
He said we broke you down into twos and wanted to find out who, in his words, who was gay, who was having affairs. They wanted to know everything about committee members, which could only be to apply private pressure on individuals.
The paper also followed the families of the lawyers suing it over hacking.
To film my 14-year-old daughter, that's actually depraved. But where was that found? It was found in the offices at the News of the World.
My children were 2 and 4 at the time, and the fear surrounding that and the upset for my family is something that I think is pretty unforgivable.
In May 2010, the election put David Cameron in Downing Street with Andy Coulson alongside, now the government's head of communications. Lord Prescott, who'd already warned David Cameron once against hiring Andy Coulson, was astonished.
When he appointed him, I reminded publicly that I wrote to him to warn him about that. So it was the second warning. I said, you'll live to regret it.
And Andy Coulson had yet to be given the highest security clearance usually applied to those working in his position.
That's very surprising, given he was at the heart of government, close to the Prime Minister. It does seem very difficult to explain.
David Cameron has said that Andy Coulson was given the appropriate level of security clearance when he was appointed. Sean Hoare, who knew all about Andy Coulson's tabloid past, was about to become the first former News of the World journalist to go on the record.
The reason why I did it was Clive Goodman, who's a friend, was basically hung out to dry, which I thought was wrong, because knowing the culture and the establishment and the corporation, I know how it operates. I just felt a sense of misjustice at the end of the day.
In September 2010, he told the New York Times that his old friend Andy Coulson must have known about phone hacking at the News of the World.
That was the moment, I think, within Scotland Yard where people started to ask questions, and certainly politically it had an effect too.
But when police interviewed Sean Hoare, he was surprised to be treated not as a witness, but as a suspect. So he told them nothing.
I was interviewed by the Met, Scotland Yard, who asked me a series of questions, and I decided to exercise my right of no comment.
News International had already used Sean Hoare's problems with drink and drugs to discredit him.
To take an individual and then try to chop him down
the way they did Sean, I think, is unforgivable.
Sean Hoare died in 2011, so he never got to see Andy Coulson stand trial.
Mr. Coulson, do you have any regrets?
The pressure on Andy Coulson over hacking intensified. He resigned, saying, when the spokesman needs a spokesman, it's time to move on. What had started as a newspaper scandal had now reached deep into David Cameron's Number 10.
People had tried to tell him about it, and yet he disregarded that advice. And so he associated himself with a group of people who had been part of a criminal conspiracy. He showed wretched judgment, and it will permanently damage his reputation as British Prime Minister.
David Cameron has said that he'd accepted the consistent assurances given by Andy Coulson that he'd had no involvement in phone hacking. News International now wanted to save its own reputation. After years of denying the full extent of phone hacking, it finally handed over evidence to the police. By then, the Met had launched a new inquiry, Operation Wheating. It would properly scrutinise the documents seized from Glenn Mulcair years before.
Operation Wheating opens now. I think the first lawyer who gets to go in and actually see the papers, so I'm very excited about this.
Many of the hacking victims were celebrities. The media lawyer represented some of them, including actress Leslie Ash, whose married name is Chapman.
The officer from Wheating showed me the papers. It said Leslie Chapman, and then it had an address. And then under the address, they said it said Fulham, and then there was a postcode.
But it wasn't about the actress.
I looked at it, and I said, it doesn't say Fulham, it says Soham. Leslie Chapman is the murdered schoolgirl from Soham's father. And it was like something dreadful came crashing down into that room. This wasn't a celebrity thing at all. This was a victim of crime and a child.
With increasing evidence of serious criminal activity, the scandal was now a threat to the wider Murdoch empire. This didn't stop News International going ahead with its annual summer party, and as usual, many of the most powerful people in Britain turned up to rub shoulders with Rupert and Rebecca.
Put a spell on you.
Turn to your right and you'd see a bishop. You'd turn to your left and you'd see Sam and David Cameron. You'd look straight ahead and you'd see Ed Balls and you'd see Ed Miliband.
As rain brought the Murdoch party to an early close, one family was learning just how far his newspapers would go to get a story. The Dowler family were finally told by police that Millie's phone had been hacked. News International contacted Mark Lewis within hours of The Guardian running the story.
They realised the seriousness of it. They realised that the game was up for them because, it wasn't possible to tell a lie. It was no longer possible to say this was a rogue reporter.
There was a moment of catharsis where people said, actually, yes, there was something very ugly in British public life that had gone wrong, and that must never happen again.
The government reacted to the outcry by setting up a massive public inquiry here at the Royal Courts of Justice into the rot at the heart of the British press and its relationship with politicians and the police. What Lord Leveson wanted to know was what had gone wrong and who knew what and when.
I happened to be by the swimming pool with very close friends that I was on holiday with. The conversation didn't take very long.
In 2006, Tessa Jowell was Culture Secretary, responsible for media regulation, when police rang saying she'd been hacked by News International. She told Lord Leveson she informed some of her cabinet colleagues.
Their reaction was also one of shock, but sympathy and concern for me, because these were, you know, they are people who are friends, as much as they were then distinguished members of the cabinet.
Panorama has asked Tessa Jowell precisely who she told in cabinet. She says she can't remember. So who was told? We understand the police briefed the Home Office, the Cabinet Office and MI5 about their investigation.
My expectation would be ministers and potentially the Home Secretary would be briefed on that type of investigation because of its implications potentially for national security.
The then Home Secretary John Reid has said he wasn't briefed about the investigation. So who in Cabinet did know? John Prescott wasn't told by the police, but Tessa Jowell was. She'd told some colleagues. So did Tony Blair know?
I find it very difficult to believe that if those ministers in 2006 that were hacked had knowledge of it, they didn't tell Tony Blair. But he must answer for when he knew and what conversations he had with those people.
If he did know, I think, and not tell me, I would have thought, I'm surprised. But that's life. I can't give you an answer whether he knew or not. You have to ask him.
We did. He told us that as far as he can recall, he knew nothing about the details of the hacking inquiry or who may have been targeted.
Whoever actually knew, no member of the cabinet admitted in public to knowledge that phone hacking went wider than what had been disclosed.
The day after the Millie Dowler story broke, Tony Blair emailed Rebekah Brooks saying, "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Thinking of you, I have been through things like this." It emerged in court that Rebekah Brooks called Tony Blair, taking him up on his offer of support.
In an hour-long phone call, Tony Blair told Rebekah Brooks to keep strong, tough up, and he even offered to act as unofficial advisor to her and the Murdochs on a between-us basis.
His advice set up an inquiry headed by the former Director of Public Prosecutions, Ken MacDonald.
I wasn't asked. If I had been asked, I'd have politely declined.
Surely Tony Blair ought to have been phoning up the Dowler family and saying, is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can do to help you? This was someone whose interest was not in helping people, it was an interest in helping a small clique of his friends.
In a statement, Tony Blair told us he's not a fair-weather friend. His advice to Rebekah Brooks was informal. He knew nothing personally about the facts of the case, but thought it essential to have a fully transparent and independent process to get to the bottom of what had happened. 4 days later, Rupert Murdoch flew into London to apologise to the Dowler family.
Mr. Murdoch, will you tell us what you said to Millie Dowler's family?
Private meeting.
Did you apologise to the Dowler family?
Suddenly, nobody wants to be Rupert Murdoch's friend. All those politicians who'd been queuing up to kiss his shoes suddenly say, actually, we never really liked him, we never trusted the guy.
Rupert Murdoch withdrew his bid for full ownership of the satellite broadcaster B-Sky B, the first challenge to his 45-year march through the British media. At Scotland Yard, the Commissioner, Sir Paul Stevenson, resigned, as did John Yates. But questions remain for the Met.
It was a failure, whatever way you dress it up. We have to be confident that the police, can act without fear or favour. If there are doubts about the thoroughness of the investigation, then it's probably appropriate that an outside force or a Magistrates Inspectorate come in and make sure that it was done to the standard we'd all expect.
Andy Coulson is now condemned as the tabloid editor who built his career on the systematic criminal hacking of hundreds of people's phones. But questions remain about how he went on to work at the heart of government.
I was given assurances that he didn't know about phone hacking. That turns out not to be the case, and I was always clear if that happened, I would apologise, and I do so unreservedly today.
David Cameron's former spin doctor is now facing jail, as is the man who hacked phones for him, Glenn Mulcaire. He'd already pleaded guilty, along with 4 journalists from the News of the World.
The police and the judiciary have finally moved in and done their job. But it will be a mistake to think that the problems which we were exposing have actually been solved.
The hacking scandal has revealed that for years, politicians, police and the press enjoyed far too close a relationship. So close, it seems, widespread criminality was overlooked. Authorities on both sides of the Atlantic are considering corporate prosecutions against Rupert Murdoch's empire. And with other papers now under investigation, the hacking scandal is far from over.